That employment stress can erode the traditional head household role, contribute to the likelihood of severity of domestic violence.
This is Brian Lynch, and welcome to my podcast series, RANE Insights on Security with Brian Lynch. Today, I am pleased to be joined by Chris Silva, who is the Behavioral Intervention Team Manager at UCLA University, one of Southern California's 5 largest employers, with over 42,000 employees, contributing over $12.7 billion in economic activity. Chris holds the Certified Threat Manager certification from the Association of Threat Assessment Professionals, and Chris is a retired Army officer with multiple combat deployments, most recently in Afghanistan, where he served as the lead advisor of an Afghan National Army Tank Battalion. Chris holds a bachelor's degree from Central Washington University in Criminal Justice, as well as an MBA from the University of Laverne. So, Chris, welcome to the podcast, and thank you for your service.
Thank you so much, Brian. Good to be here.
Well, today we're going to talk about the threat assessment team and managing insider threats, a topic that many companies, unfortunately, have dealt with and will be dealing with in the future, particularly impacted by the events over the course of the past year and a half or so. And today, specifically, we'll be speaking with Chris about managing behaviors of employees, focusing on the impact these behaviors are having on businesses and the socialization of coming back to work. Chris, let's start with how you would characterize the stressors in today's workplace environment.
It's important to keep in mind that any and all conditions that existed prior to the pandemic, which have gone unaddressed during this time, have the potential to have become worse. And we can use a couple of examples like substance abuse and or domestic violence, both of which are key components of workplace violence. And, even when treatment was sought beforehand, likely saw those sessions done at the very best via video chat, and at worst, not done at all. I've heard of reports of both of those situations. And when it comes to substance abuse in particular, here in California, in a bid to keep restaurant workers employed, a noble gesture, I might add, they've loosened up alcohol pickup and deliveries from restaurants. And similarly, I see marijuana delivery service billboards. And both those things have unintended consequences where, in the fight for financial upkeep and benefit, we've made these things available, but the unintended consequences, of course, were making those abused substances easier to obtain for those that have shut in. But when it comes to hard drugs like methamphetamine, cocaine, heroin, et cetera, they've also suffered a paradigm shift under the current COVID-19 pandemic. In shut in, a lot of customers have had to rely on dealers they didn't know, and therefore getting those drugs in unknown strength and or quantity. And what hospitals are seeing there is a huge increase in overdose cases. Substance abuse is a pretty dark realm in this scenario. And again, if we go to domestic or relationship violence, and we can agree that traditionally that has been carried out by a male partner on a female partner the majority of times, but of course not always. And those behaviors can be exacerbated by unemployment, underemployment, and other distressors that we're going to be discussing. That employment stress can erode the traditional head household role, contribute to the likelihood of severity of domestic violence. when we look at added stressors, the differences in workplace and university experience, from scheduling all the way to the lack of face-to-face human interaction, that challenge is immeasurable. You just need to turn on the television to realize that civil unrest has become more intense over the last year. And I'll go as far as saying an acceptable way of communicating is one's point. And I think that one thing that we would have found hard to believe was traditional bedrocks of society are being challenged. For instance, who would have thought that, a movement would have gone so far as to do as much as change police reform. And, the downside is many of these folks with less pragmatic and less realistic issues can feel their concerns are equally as empowered as those. And they get a glimmer of hope from those.
Chris, that's a great overview. So what I'm hearing is some of the stressors for employees really haven't changed during the dynamic of the pandemic and the way in which companies have decided to have their workforce work from home or in some other fashion, whether it's hybrid or like in production facilities where they have to go to work and wear masks, et cetera. Substance abuse, domestic violence, and then you noted civil unrest. And I think, an important point that you made was the challenge or the norms of society are being challenged in some fashion, particularly around policing and other areas that we see related to civil unrest. So let me ask you this. The stressors that were prevalent prior to the pandemic, some have only intensified, if you will, going forward into the pandemic. And then we also have some stressors that have really hit people hard related directly to the pandemic. Can you differentiate that for our listeners? What should we be looking for when some of our employees come back from either work from home or are being hired in other companies, et cetera?
Great question. Things to look for. It's important to realize that, employees will be physically returning to a workplace where both they and the employer have had placed a greater reliance on automation, technology, and far less dependence on face-to-face meetings and travel as well. In my own office, we've got I won't say new, we've got an individual who was hired over a year ago, has been an integral part of the team, and proven himself time and time again. And I've never met the man because he was hired just after, the work from home order. And so that's an interesting dynamic that we've never had to face before. Differences in points of view surrounding current topics and volatile topics like vaccination, personal protective equipment, and social distancing. These are going to be things that we see out in public that are going to be very, very emotionally charged when we return to work. There's going to be new policies and new procedures that have been put in place that people are, unfamiliar with, or at least the changes. Employees returning to work are going to have dispositions that vary widely from wary and prudent all the way to excitable and intense. And I, as an employer, we need to be able to identify those and work with those because they're all very relevant. So I've got something of a technique that I'm going to propose, and that's sort of a consideration of a loosened response towards policy enforcement. And I'd say that especially comes to fruition when it comes to corporate rules on policies like time and attendance and employee and customer relations. A relaxed view puts the employee's best interest at heart with a few things to keep in mind. I think that, that relaxed point of view needs to have a time cap put on it, sort of a gradual phase out after 30, 60, or 90 days. And that posture needs to be communicated as the corporate point of view throughout the workforce in order to alleviate any confusion. But on the flip side, certain policies can't be looked at leniently. And in my paradigm, those include workplace violence prevention policy and weapon restriction policies, and those both need to remain at zero tolerance.
Yeah, Chris, all great points. And I know you've talked about how important reintegration and resocialization would be for our employers to be to recognize that process is going to be ongoing as people come back into the office setting. And as we all know, stressors affect people in different ways. And you have certainly highlighted some of the stressors that we've been dealing with over the past year and a half. Can you talk a little bit about the reintegration and the resocialization processes?
Absolutely. I don't think that any of us could have ever imagined that we would have become our own desktop support personnel, having worked from home. And I mentioned technology challenges previously, but folks, Wi-Fi from their home and other problems that are traditionally handled by on-site IT professionals now become something of the realm of the user. Kind of more to your point, some of our coworkers are not going to be returning to the office, and that's due to downsizing. Perhaps they'll take on a hybrid or a work from home scenario that was not in place previously. Resocialization is something that we need to look at because a lot of people have been isolated, both socially and in their employment, and so that face-to-face interaction is going to take a little bit of a renewal effort. I think that it would be naive to expect people come back and it's just exactly where we left off. I think that social efforts on the part of the employer, whether it's and these can vary by the workplace's culture, whether if it's lunch out or ice cream or happy hour or whatever, those kind of things are going to be a little more important, having to bring back folks who haven't seen each other for such a long length of time. The other reacclimating, very similar. I think that understanding what one has not necessarily been exposed to in their aligned departments or colleagues' work area that they used to have a lot of visibility on is going to be something of a challenge for that person. And so I think that this learning curve needs to be understood by the employer, by the employee, by supervisors, et cetera, so that we can have a solid return to work that is appreciated and goes a long way towards business goals. Something else when it becomes time to return to work that is a big issue, especially here in LA, traffic and commuting. We haven't had to deal with that for a long time. And in the few times that I have been out on the freeway, it's wide open and something of a dream issue. And so that's going to become a reality again. One thing that people have grown used to is probably that work-life balance that may now be in jeopardy. They've had a lot less time on the road, a lot less time commuting, actually sitting at home, have the kids nearby, being able to get up and get some dinner on the stove and everybody eat together because, maybe there were restaurant shutdowns or what have you in that area, that the family values are going to again be put to the test. That goes doubly for anybody that's a single parent. And people are naturally going to have a level of anxiety surrounding returning to work. And it's important to understand that is going to be the case.
Great point there. What you're talking about and what I'm hearing is the ability to reconnect is going to be critically important to the employees, to the workplace, to the business. And, things are different than they were pre-pandemic. You look at some of the literature that's out there relative to what happened in the last year and a half, and some have opined that we went through a second industrial revolution. We figured out that, first of all, the employers have figured out that they can get their work done with their employees who don't come to the office every day. And I think more importantly, the employees have figured out that they can do their job without going to the office every day. So you look at all the differences and all the changes, and sometimes change is a stressor too, right? And so it's very, very interesting the points you make there. And it's just not going to be like it was in December 2019 when they come back, right?
Yeah, you said it, Brian.
When we hire an employee, the firm is linked together with that employee forever, whether we like it or not, for the good and for the bad. For example, if we have an issue with performance or behavior and we terminate that employee, it doesn't stop at the termination. And I think firms have understood that and have adapted some of their processes for terminating or removal from service, some call it. And so the next part of this is really about what can the firm do? Having said all of this, making all your points about what the stressors are, what has changed, how people and employees react differently to all these stressors. Nonetheless, employees have to manage this and execute in this environment. So what does that look like, Chris?
Yesterday, you made a point that I wanted to reuse, and I definitely give you credit. That was the metaphor of the steam pipe. You can snap that valve wide open instantly, but I think that in this case, the metaphorical combination is to slowly open that valve, and people can be looked at similarly. That reintegration is a process; it's not a race, and so that measured approach is critical here. But more to your point, as far as termination, employee actions, negative actions, and things of that nature, I think that it's going to be critical, having not had our eyes on our coworkers for, again, over a year in many cases, to take a deep dive into what has happened with them over that period of time. And that's going to be challenging. But coworkers are often a great source of information, to find out if the individual in question, the subject, if you will, was somebody in their household unemployed or underemployed, up to and including the individual in question, him or herself. And we can't assume that they didn't suffer any catastrophes at home during the pandemic. I am blessed enough to have not lost anybody to COVID-19, but we can't assume that of everyone else. And that would be a huge traumatic stressor for a family. Likewise, was the employee, him or her, sick, or anybody else in their family unit suffering any ongoing health issues that were never, expected prior to this pandemic. And, if there are no work friend relationships or anything of that nature that allows that insight, then it's going to be rely on things like social media investigating and taking a look at, troubled coworkers' social media posts. Did they put anything up concerning over the past 12 months? And, it's fair game. I mean, these are public source information, and people put that out there for others to look at. And there's no expectation of privacy when those kinds of things are put out on the public domain. So I can't overemphasize the importance of understanding how folks have dealt with the life situations in such a peculiar time in history, how they dealt with that, and how they've come out of it.
Yeah, Chris, I think that's a great point. And you used a term before that I really like, which is duty to care. And I think it's all wrapped in our employees are our employees. We did the best we can and could over the past year and a half. We've had Zoom meetings, and we've met with folks, and now as things are coming back into the office setting, we really need to be aware of, and I like your point of it's almost like taking an inventory of your employees about how they're doing, right? And it's that duty to care, and it's really assessing where they are, and maybe what do they need from us outside of just performing at the workplace. And I've always found, Chris, that when the firm cares about their employees, that message is received loud and clear, and it means a lot to employees, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I think that an investment in an employee is not only ethically correct, but there's a business case that retention of employees is a fraction of the cost of bringing on somebody new when you take into consideration payroll and training time and things of that nature. So I think it's money well spent.
And what we're really getting to is, if you're really engaged with the employee and you take that inventory and you care about them, then they are less likely to become problems at the workplace. And that's the key that we're trying to pick up on, right? Are those what I call breadcrumbs, but those behaviors or those comments that will cause somebody a little bit of pause. And it's really important, I think, for companies to understand that they really need to be in tune to their employees as they come back, like they have over the past year and a half and before that. But it's really critically important to do it now, because, Chris, you and I talked about yesterday the number of active shooter incidents that have occurred in the U.S. in 2020 was more than we saw in 2019. And you would think, well, how could that be? We don't have folks working in offices, but we still, as you outlined before, there are stressors and added stressors that we had from the pandemic that added to some of this concern. And we didn't even talk about the ability of one or two parent households to deal with schooling and homeschooling and the stressor involved in that. So can you comment a little bit about that as well, Chris?
Yeah, of course. We've been able to spend time with the kids, whether it was by choice or otherwise, and that was for the most part looked on positively. And even if it did have a bit of a distraction element to it when it came to work, I think most employers, from what I gather, understood that the kids were trying to engage in school from home, and that took a bit of effort to supervise and overwatch from the parent who may have also been working from home, and there's a bit of a trade-off there. But again, that time at home can be a positive, but on the flip side, we're not accustomed to, in most cases, supervising children who would normally be at school. And so you can't dismiss the stress that's involved with that. Most of us are not trained educators, and therefore picking up where the teacher or teacher's normal role falls into place, that's not what many of us have been trained to do. So there's definitely a bit of a challenge to that. The stress of, having to balance that with one's own profession, if they were working from home, is always an issue. That goes along with if you've got more than one child at home, I think it compounds it even more. Any of us that have raised kids realize that they'd rather be horsing around and playing, especially if there's more than one kid involved, and rather than paying attention to schoolwork. And that poses that challenge to mom or dad who are also trying to get work done from home. So I think that there's those challenges and others that might be hard to conceive of that need to be taken into account, because this is again a time in history that we've never really had to deal with before.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're coming to the end of our discussion today, but there's 2 points that I want to raise before we sign off. The first one, Chris, providing our listeners, our companies that are listening, some of the key elements that firms should focus on relative to the design of their threat assessment teams. And then the second point is maybe just a quick summary of key actions that companies should consider relative to trying to get things back to normal post-pandemic.
Great. I think that when it comes to threat assessment teams, Brian, paying particular attention to the mental health component that you have on board that threat assessment team, whether it's in-house or whether it's contracted or something like that. I think that this is the time to really pay close attention to that, because of course you're going to have your security law enforcement component already there. HR needs to really be given a strong voice in this day and age in threat assessment. General management, of course, but if you've got insurance and risk management and others that provide key inputs, I would say that it's time to schedule a bit of an overview again with your EAP, your psychological care component, and make sure that they are able to articulate what they perceive as challenges to the workplace. And then as far as summary, I think that it's time to discuss how returning to work is likely to impact that workplace specifically. What issues are unique to the industry and that location? And finally, determine what steps part of management, the team agrees on to make reintegration a more smooth and welcoming process.
Yeah, all great points, Chris. I really appreciate the summary and providing this to our listeners. And it's been great having you today. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Brian. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you, and appreciate the opportunity.
If you liked what you heard today and would like to learn how RANE helps members monitor relevant risk developments and more efficiently respond to and mitigate key threats, visit us at ranenetwork.com. That's RANE network.com.